Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Welcome to this virtual space convened by UC Berkeley's Cannabis Research Center. My name is Joanna Hossack. I'm a specialist in the Institute of Urban and Regional Development. For those of you who don't know, the Cannabis Research Center has been around since 2017, and since then we've been studying issues related to cannabis agriculture, the environment, and local land use policy. I invite you to check out our website, crc.berkeley.edu, to view our past webinars and future events, and to read our reports and policy briefs. We're also going to include our link tree in the chat so you can register for future events. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our host for today's webinar, Genine Coleman, the founder and executive director of Origins Council. Genine lives in Mendocino County, and she cultivated cannabis for over 20 years before entering the cannabis policy space. Her organization, Origins Council, is dedicated to sustainable rural economic development within cannabis-producing regions and establishing cannabis appellations. Origins Council has a regional council comprised of trade associations representing legacy-producing regions across the state, including the counties of Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity, which are going to be discussed today. So Genine, thank you so much. We are so grateful for your time and appreciate you joining us today. Please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Joanna. It's such a pleasure to be here. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, can hear you great.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, thank you for having us. I'm really excited for this conversation today, and would love to move forward and introduce Dr. Robert Eyler, who I've had the pleasure of working with in supporting this study. Dr. Eyler is a professor of economics at Sonoma State University, where he's been teaching since 1995, and he earned a PhD from the University of California, Davis in 1998. And a BA in economics at CSU Chico in 1992. Dr. Eyler also serves on the board of directors of Redwood Credit Union, a $9 billion nonprofit financial cooperative. And Robert's been a visiting scholar at both the University of Bologna and Stanford University, and his family has been sheep and cattle ranchers in Marin and Sonoma counties since 1910. Pleasure to be here with you, Rob.
Thanks, Genine.
So we can just go ahead and dive right in and discuss the economic impacts of the cannabis industry in Northern California counties, the economic impact report. Rob, can you give us a high-level overview of the report and perhaps let us know how the report came to be and who your collaborators were in the study?
Totally. So about 5 years ago, I received a message from Cal Poly Humboldt and their Institute for Cannabis Research. And they had asked me about being a partner on a research grant that was coming out of Department of Cannabis Control at the time, the Bureau of Cannabis Control, that was going to finance different economic studies. And the one they wanted to do, because they had seen other economic impacts, other impact reports I had done, was to look at the 6 counties from Sonoma, Lake, Mendocino, Humboldt, Del Norte, and Trinity, and what their economic impact on those 6 counties has been based on with respect to a base year. So the idea is, can we measure the size of the cannabis industry in those 6 counties along the entire supply chain and try to understand how much larger the economic effects are because the cannabis industry exists and has grown, or if it grows, what algorithmic connections can we make to say if it grows by a certain amount, we actually would see these larger economic effects. Unfortunately, we could also go backward on that and say if there was some reduction in the cannabis industry, we could talk about how that actually would be a detriment to the regional economy as well. But the idea was to really look at those 6 counties, as discussed earlier, kind of legacy cultivation counties, and really think about, okay, where do we find the connections between what happens with cannabis farms, manufacturing, distribution, and retail to other parts of the 6 counties' economies. So at a really high level, that was the goal, is to be able to quantify the size of the industry along major supply chain nodes and how the size of those nodes had a larger than themselves, or what later we'll probably call a multiplier effect, on the 6 counties. Now, there's some nuances in doing these kind of studies, which we'll probably get into a little bit here and there. But at a high level, that's what we were trying to do, is measure the core impact, or we're going to call later the direct impact, and then the larger full impact, where the ratio of those two is basically the multiplier.
And can you tell us a bit about what your relationship was like working with the cannabis industry during the process?
Totally. So once I had spoken to Cal Poly Humboldt and we decided to try to gain access to the grant money and we got it, there were sort of three connections that I made right away, or at least tried to facilitate, knowing that I might be seen as an outsider in the industry, knowing that there's still this sort of friction between the unregulated and the regulated industries, and sometimes people are doing both. And I had a large amount of education throughout this process, and we'll probably talk about that as we go too. So that part one was to try to get to know the cannabis industry providers. Two were to get to know folks like y'all, Genine, that were advocates of the cannabis industry and really kind of more in the policy space. And then the third was to try to connect better to the Bureau and then the Department of Cannabis Control, with the idea that they've had some gatekeeping in terms of potentially raw data that would be helpful for the study. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about track and trace. But those are kind of the three immediate relationships that I needed to try to put together to be able to really find out on the ground what was happening from the cannabis industry, some of the sort of rumblings that the policy advocates were dealing with along the way, and sort of that seeing the two together is really trying to consider what were the challenges and opportunities in the industry to kind of give more color to the numbers, but really just to try to figure out if we get our hands on data, and we'll talk a little bit more probably about the survey we did in a minute. Do those numbers sound realistic? Are they too conservative, too optimistic? How do they jive with what DCC will generate? And that we really wanted to try to find a balance among all those forces in terms of the generation of the data, but then also providing color around what are some policy implications, challenges, and opportunities that the data tell us, or that we want to make sure we connect to the current industry level and potentially some of the history since 2017 in terms of either the growth or the slide in the size of the industry.
Can I ask a question? This is Felipe. And hi, Genine, great to see you. There was an EIR that was used in part of the rulemaking process. Is this the EIR that was used by the government for that rulemaking?
No, that actually was a report. That's a great question. That was a report that was done as what they call an SRIA, which is sort of a very specific report that supports the rulemaking process. It had some economic impact elements to it, but was not just more of a focal economic impact report. I used that report as a basis to try to think about, okay, what did they know going into that report that will help me try to find the foundational data, or to think about the relationships I need to forge to be able to support what I was going to do. So I did use that report as part of the literature in terms of the original original basis for the direction I wanted to go, but it's not the same.
Okay, and second question, there you mentioned the surveys. There was a survey that a gentleman, I forget his last name, Terry something. Were you working with Terry on this?
No, but Terry is somebody that I know. I think it's Terry in Sonoma County.
Yes.
With Go Local. Yeah, so Terry and I have worked on another project before this one that was much more focused on Sonoma County's footprint. And I don't know if Terry's put out surveys since then, but you may have received that somewhere in about 6 or 7 years ago. He and I were collaborating at that time on that one. If you've gotten something from Terry since then, it's for a different study.
Got it. Great. All right. Just honing in on exactly what this is.
100%.
Well, I just wanted to speak briefly to how grateful my organization and our regional partner organizations and Humboldt County Growers Alliance was another partner on the study. We really valued the opportunity to work with you, Rob, and support this study. And just for some context, so our organizations represent 400 licensed small independent cannabis businesses in the North Coast predominantly. And they're largely homestead medical cannabis farming families that operated for decades under California's medical cannabis laws, transitioned in licensing upon legalization. And we've known anecdotally that cannabis has been a huge economic driver in the North Coast for decades. And this report really provides the first opportunity we've had to work with sound economic data in our advocacy to really drive sustainable rural economic development in the North Coast. So really appreciate the opportunity and the work that you've done, Rob, and look forward to building upon this work. Wanted to ask you, what are the chief issues that you really saw with the cannabis industry in doing this study?
Thanks. And I also just real quickly want to thank Genine and all the partners we had during the study. Without them, I would not have been able to have more, let's say, street credibility with the cannabis industry in such a way to generate the data we did and actually finish the report. The issues seem to be kind of categorically twofold. One was this sort of unknown future policy environment that was coming out of the regulations, in that it looked like initially that most people reacted to the taxation environment, the regulatory environment, as extremely burdensome. And there were some people who were willing to take on that burden. There was a few service professionals who came in alongside to try to support that change. The primary change was I had an unregulated business. I wanted to become a regulated business. Thus, I was taking on a very large compliance effort, and alongside with a bunch of other potential compliance efforts throughout what I did, just not only in reporting data, but also in what I did in everyday operations. And that there was not an enormous amount of support coming from the regulatory body. So it was here are the costs, but the benefits were not, at least when we started and I started talking to people, it seemed like that the benefits were not as strong as the costs. And that was leading to this kind of weird situation where the study I talked about earlier that we did in Sonoma County as just to kind of get a toehold on these issues, was that you really had people who were in this sort of frictional space between, do I actually go into the regulated market or do I stay unregulated, because the regulatory cost is so burdensome, it'll undermine the economics of what I do every day. And as long as I'm willing to take on the opportunity cost of potentially having criminal prosecution, living in the unregulated space, I'm just going to keep on trucking. So one of the things that was always concerning when the regulations went live, and then as I've worked on and off alongside of the industry over the last 6 or 7 years, has been what seems like to be the lack of incentives, or at least the lack of a pathway by which, hey, you've grown cannabis for a really long period of time. Great. We want to get you into the regulated market, but we want to do it with a minimum burden on you, because we see the benefits as a regulator to you making that change. And we want you to see the benefits of making that change to try to eliminate this sort of parallel industry movement that we did not want in the first place when the regulations passed. So that sort of weird back and forth with the regulatory environment was a big one. Maybe alongside of that, which one could make a case was a function of the regulatory environment, was how the supply chain took place, and how, let's say, legacy growers really were kind of left without what I would consider to be strong market support, because there was a pop in supply that was not, considered, or at least was not, I shouldn't say it that way, was so quick to come to market that it really left pricing in such a way that it was a second reason why it undermined, why should I make a transition? So the market forces that took place were not necessarily considered in terms of the licensing and how much cannabis started to flow into market, which then depressed prices, which then changed the economic outcomes for folks maybe either making the transition or that had always been very niche and had been more entrepreneurial. And then you have a larger producer who would come in, undermine market forces, and then leave the economics of the smaller producer behind. Now, we'll talk later about some of the opportunities along that, maybe in terms of maybe, thinking about where to go from here. But really the where we go from here in some ways probably should have happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago, for better or for worse. But we'll talk about that timeline and some of the barriers to that too, probably along the way. But those were probably the two things that I saw as the chief issues, that if those were resolved, the current state of the market and maybe the continued transition of people from the unregulated to regulated space would be easier.
Yeah, I think those are really salient points and what we're grappling with, in an enduring way here.
Yeah.
So I think data access is an interesting consideration in terms of this study. You worked with the California Cannabis Track and Trace data, surveys, interviews. Can you speak to any challenges you faced in accessing data and how you navigated data gaps?
Totally. So to not make a long story even longer, this study, as I suggested, kind of started in 2020. We finally did it and finished it in 2024. And the reason why it took so long was kind of two major items, both of which went to data. One is that it took about maybe 6 or 8 months just to get to the point where we felt comfortable with asking the cannabis industry in the 6 counties to do yet another survey. And parallel to that, we started to do in-person, on the phone, anonymous interviews, just again to get kind of a toehold of what was going on in the industry, or get some stories and some color around cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, different types of distribution and manufacturing, retail, consumer concerns. At the end of the study, we were starting to hear more about actually having regulations around lounges, so having on-premise versus off-premise retail. And one of the things I went into, which was somewhat naive and was my own fault, is that I felt like that approaching this as I had done in other cases where I've looked at the wine industry, I felt like, okay, wine industry is very proximate to what goes on in the cannabis industry here in Northern California. In some ways, it had, I think, a similar viewpoint pre-regulation toward regulation. And then once the regulatory sort of blanket went over the industry, it showed a lot of the differences. But thinking about terroir, region, stories, niche, tourism, how the flow of product, and really establishing kind of a world-class place to find world-class product. I thought all those kind of in combination really set the stage for, okay, this is where this industry can go, using the wine industry in Northern California kind of as a model. But it took a long time just to get started to kind of feel like, okay, in fact, that's probably not going to be the right way to look at this, because the unregulated versus regulated bifurcation made a lot of challenges in terms of the data gathering. So then we had to think, okay, how do we protect people when they answer the survey? And let me just take a quick right turn. Gaining access to data in the wine industry, which I'll come back to at the very end, is relatively straightforward, but also has challenges. A lot of it does also come from survey data, for better or for worse. So you have to almost have this rhythm of saying, here, when you see this survey, think of it, it's going to serve two purposes. It's going to give you more information when we aggregate the results about the industry. And second, you can use it for policy making and sort of saying, here, this is why we need to advocate for this agriculture. So I kind of walked in and say, okay, we got to be able to find some data or some people that want to talk about what's going on for those two reasons. And we found out that it was very tough to do that. People were concerned about the data being used for potential criminal prosecution. They didn't want to be named. They wanted to give as little information as possible. You wanted to provide precise questions, but then providing precise questions, the language around that could be somewhat confusing. So we had to figure out a way of sort of, asking very narrow questions just to get over the data hurdle on the surveys. It seemed like the in-person interviews I did were much more fruitful in terms of not only providing color, but people actually talking more openly about the price challenges, the regulatory challenges, their own decision to go from unregulated to regulated or not. And in the room, we had a mix of both. I had phone interviews where I had a mix of both. So the data gathering process in terms of the industry data gathering from surveys, interviews, group sessions, the policy group we had, and really even the advocacy groups around, there was a struggle just to get people to talk, or to get people to fill out what they thought was yet another survey with an unknown outcome. And I totally understand that. I mean, if you don't have sort of a natural pathway by which the information I'm going to give to you in a survey, I see the fruit of it, just like when you get a survey as an email. It's like, why am I doing this survey? So we had to convince people to really get into it. And, we always, in survey work, you can always get more responses. But I felt like, and I remember us having this discussion probably in mid or late 2022, that, okay, I think we kind of have a toehold. Okay, so we took that as sort of part one. And then part two was, okay, now let me ask DCC what data they can provide me. And now they have a dashboard, which I'll come back to in just a second and talk about, which had a lot of information that I ended up having to kind of gain access from the raw files. But they basically gave me the entire metric data set in a raw form. And if you've ever worked with kind of like, text data, then I had to do a lot of data transformation, a lot of data cleansing, a lot of things that prepared it for analysis that the data were not kind of set to do. There were a lot of gaps in the data that suggested that people were not completing the data inputs, or that the information was not there. And what I had hoped for when I had gained access to the file is, in fact, from an economic standpoint, is I would be able to do kind of three things overall. One would be able to say, for each one of the major supply chain nodes, think cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, retail, can I generate a way of looking at different price points, different volumes in essence, which is going to sound super nerdy and kind of super like Econ 101. Can I actually figure out a demand curve or a supply curve in such a way to say, okay, now we can actually track the movement of the market, because we feel like we have a toehold on the market dynamics. And unfortunately, in most cases, I could not do that from track and trace. For track and trace, you could get quantities sometimes, but the quantities were mixed between milliliters, grams, kilograms, pounds. So I turned into like this gigantic potter's mill from chemistry, data or units conversion person. And I had to set a bunch of algorithms. A lot of those files had 1 million lines of data. So I had to set an algorithm up in my statistical package to just be able to mine all those data and recategorize them and move around. That took almost 2 months because it was really, the data were very dirty. Now, to DCC's credit, they told me it was going to be dirty, which was concerning, but there was not consistent price quantity data. So I could not figure out directly revenue generated by each one of the supply chain nodes, or track how one sale went to manufacturing or went to distribution, which then also went to retail. And retail was probably the most robust data in terms of price and quantity, because you need price and quantity to figure out how much you're going to tax it. And so, and the taxation data helped as well. But I recommended this to DCC when I spoke with them on the phone. I said, well, we have to get to a point where, especially for people who want more to, you really want to make a statement about the economics of the industry, you're going to need price and quantity, which again sounds very pedantic to say, but at the end of the day, if you don't have that, you can't really make a great statement. So once I felt like I was able to analyze the metric data in the aggregate for the 6 counties and split them up, and then map over that the licensure data to be able to figure out, what's active, what's not, which also was a little bit of a gap in information. I was able to bring it back to y'all, and then we started talking about, okay, is this an actual statement we can make about specifically the 2022 year data? The 2023 year data came after we ended the project. So in being able to track the evolution of volume, which you now can do on the dashboard, which is great. So if you want to look at the volume, the dashboard does a pretty good job of that. But to me, to really get to the next level in terms of analysis, we're going to need dollars of movement and be able to talk about it with precision at each one of those supply chain nodes to know, hey, what value add is happening in each stage? Because one of the sort of outcomes of a study like this is, can we make a statement about, okay, if there is, let's say, $500 million worth of cannabis, of raw cannabis sold in Humboldt County, where does it go, and how much of that value add when it goes from raw to a final retail product is maintained here in Humboldt County, as one example? So, and the way it's set up right now, I believe Humboldt cannabis actually moves out of Humboldt County, whether into the unregulated market or into the regulated market toward retail some other place. And most of the retail is concentrated where people are, which is smart. But the idea is that we do not have a great way in the data that comes from the regulator yet, it might come, of being able to say, okay, if you're going to track and trace everything, can I actually follow the movement of a pound of cannabis from Humboldt to its final state? And if that's possible, I couldn't figure it out, and DCC didn't have an answer. And I don't think the data currently as shown on the dashboard gives you that answer yet. Now, is that important? And the answer is, well, it could be, in terms of thinking, okay, well, if we're trying to figure out how we maintain value added in California, does does Los Angeles County end up really converting Humboldt County cannabis into a value-added product that goes out in retail? And if that's true, then are there larger strategic partnerships that can happen where major markets exist that actually provide more economic benefit for both areas? We have no idea right now. So I can't even figure out where it all ends up in retail precisely to be able to know, are there some strategic partnerships here? Or, for example, are there tourism? And think of the expansion of the supply chain. If people are buying Humboldt-based product in Los Angeles County, they may want to come to where it's produced. And if they do that, you start to expand the economic impacts of the industry because you're generating that sort of additional value add that you're able to bring back to Humboldt, analogous to how the wine industry works. If I live in Des Moines, Iowa, and I drink a Napa Valley wine, that might give me an incentive to travel to Napa Valley, which then is going to bring that tourism income to Napa rather than the folks going to the East Coast or something to that effect. So I was hoping that at the end of the day, the data would allow us to start making statements like that and then provide policy guidance on the other side, alongside of just making a statement about the economic impacts. Does that answer?
Well,
does that seem like a way of at least characterizing it? Because I mean, you and I were kind of hand in hand for a lot of this, so I don't know if I was missing anything.
Yeah. No, it's all coming back to me, and it was a pretty interesting process.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great layout of really kind of what we went through and the extensive work you had to do with the raw data. Well, I'd love to just invite you to kind of offer findings from the study broadly, whatever you'd like to put forward that you haven't touched on yet.
Yeah, sure. So I think the best sort of way of characterizing the findings is to say, look, when you do an economic impact study, what you're really saying is that if I take an industry and its current value add, meaning how much income does that generate that stays at home in the defined geographic area, how many other industries, jobs, and how much tax revenue locally is generated because of the size of that local industry. And so a good way to characterize it that I had heard maybe almost 20 years ago that I keep using is to think about taking a rock and throwing it into a still pond. So the size of the rock will tell you the size of the ripple effect from the rock going in. And so you can think of the size of the rock as being the statement through data of the current economic size of an industry. And then ultimately the ripple effects are how much larger, in thinking from a top view, the concentric circles are out from the rock's entry into the pool that affect the rest of the pooled area. So in the case of, let's say, Humboldt County, again, the size of the cannabis industry when it goes in to that county, or we identify how large it is in the first place, it has this sort of expansive effect through vendors and through employee spending that starts to spread its wings throughout a bunch of different industries that have nothing to do directly with the cannabis industry, but have to do indirectly with the people that are paid by the industry as vendors, or the people who work for the industry as employees and their spending. So what you're doing in an economic impact study, and there's a software called Implan that has really, in essence, become the flagship of how this gets done. And they've done a great job in really expanding how much data you get about different geographies and how the modeling works. It tells you that once you enter the data and say, okay, for this industry, here's the economic size that I think we feel pretty good about in terms of the current estimate, it will calculate all the rest of that for you. And on the more nerdy side, what you're really doing is you have kind of what you think of as a make and a use, or you can think of as a supply and a demand matrix that come together. And when you push one of the vectors within the matrix on the use side, no, gotta make sure I say this right, on the make side, that then stimulates changes in the matrix based on how the rows and the columns of the two matrices are related, that then leads to a change in the total volume within each matrix. And that's the economic impact. Now, on the less nerdy side, again, think of the still pond and the rock entering it. So when the rock goes in, those are what you think of as the direct economic impacts. Then there's these indirect impacts, which are on the industry's employees and the vendors. And then there's induced impacts, which expands the spending. And then the sum of the concentric circles are what we think of as the total impact. So for the study area, our 6 counties, we found that there was a little over about $1.058 billion worth of direct impacts that then created about just under 1.5 billion of value added in these 6 counties. So that was just in cultivation. For manufacturing, it was a little smaller, it was about 240 million that then created about 313 million. But let me stop there. That ratio of those two to each other is meant to be the so-called multiplier effect. So if in other studies or in other places you've heard of a so-called multiplier effect, the easiest way of thinking about that is that the total economic impacts divided by the direct economic impacts tell you how much larger in percentage terms you're getting out of the local area because of that industry's either entry, growth, or current size. So depending on which one you're measuring, that's what we just talked about here. Distribution was smaller, is about 15 and 18 million for the 6 counties in aggregate. And then retail, based on the taxation data, had retail sales of about 180 million. But the trickiness of that is that retail sales, because you've already counted all those other inputs in other places, only really created about 36 million of additional value or of value added. So the difference there is about 53 million in terms of that multiplier effect from retail. And this is classic in retail studies with economic impacts, because you have already counted a lot of those impacts, especially if you're buying local goods in retail. And also, if you're buying it from outside, you would be counting imported goods in value add, which is a big no-no in economics. It's a little bit smaller. But those are, in essence, the sizes where these 6 counties are really dominant in cultivation, which we kind of already knew. So one of the other findings from the raw data was that, especially Mendocino and Humboldt County, in many of the licenses within cultivation, those 2 counties have almost half the licenses in the state, because there's and it really tells the story of how deep and wide the industry is in those 2 counties, Humboldt and Mendocino counties. But so cultivation is really the dominant economic force in the 6 counties. But because of Sonoma County size, there's a little bit more retail manufacturing happening there. And the more that pipeline can happen, and this is some of the things we talk about in the report, is sort of thinking for the future, is whether or not you could see more of a pipeline of tourism moving up through Sonoma County, potentially, almost like a welcome center, and then moving north to really see what's happening. But building that infrastructure and having the openness, which is more of the qualitative piece of it, to people actually tromping around and being some places for generations. We don't want anybody, much less the cops, is a little bit of a cultural shift that we're probably still, maybe unfortunately, 5 or 7 years away from minimum from being able to mechanize in full. However, in 2017, I was really hoping the regulatory environment was going to say, hey, look, we know this is a possibility. We want to facilitate that by giving you an incentive to move from an unregulated to regulated environment. And then we're going to build this infrastructure with economic development professionals alongside. That has not happened to date. At least I haven't observed it yet. It may be starting, but I don't believe it's really started to move in earnest, specifically in Mendocino and Humboldt.
Sure. Well, I think that there's a lot of incentive right now because things are so enormously challenging on the ground. Yeah. And looking at the historic and current licensing data, in 2022, the state of California had 2,500 licensed independent small farms cultivating under an acre of cannabis. Those are, we understand, predominantly the legacy farming community, the historic medical cannabis farmers that transitioned into licensing. That data today, we have 1,500 of those licensed small farms left. We're losing these licensed small-scale independent farms at an alarming rate. I personally anticipate that number to reach about 1,000 by the end of this year. And so, the situation really requires urgent intervention, legislative intervention at a local, state, federal level. I think we're really fortunate in the North Coast to have excellent elected representatives who, for the most part, really care deeply about this historic agricultural sector and the crisis really facing the sector. And I think the North Coast broadly, as economic conditions continue to increase in terms of challenge. But, we're seeing that the scale of reform that's needed is overwhelming the pace and the scale of change that they're really able to effectuate. And in kind of looking at the, ripples in the pond in terms of the economic downturn for the North Coast cannabis industry, we look at regions like Laytonville and Mendocino County, Barberville and Humboldt County, and then entire counties like Trinity. We're seeing impacts that are pretty severe. Community-supported nonprofit organizations that have historically been supported by cannabis dollars shuttering, a whole host of local businesses closing, including we're seeing fundamental services like grocery stores shutting down. And food banks, I think this is like one of the most, really kind of heartbreaking data points that I've heard recently. Seeing an increase in demand of 60 to 200% in the past 18 months. So I think it'd be great to sort of transition to, what we're seeing. Where do we go from here, right? So looking at the challenges and opportunities, what kind of solutions do we need, and what do we see as potentials to stabilize the sector?
Totally. And thanks, Gene, for reviewing all that. I think it does tell a tale. And so one of the issues in terms of watching and metrics to watch, are taxable sales going down generally, which suggests that you're seeing vendor purchases receding, you're seeing employees spending receding, you're seeing less sales that are taxable happening in terms of even the cannabis industry itself. All that tells a tale of a changing industry on the downslide rather than on the up. And then you look at housing prices, land prices, and how those are changing right now. If you look at the housing data, and I'll wrap this all around to some of these other points in just a second, we want to think about, is this really starting to ripple out in the negative that, wow, I mean, I've got nothing to do with the cannabis industry, but because we never really supported a very deeply rooted, pardon the pun, industry in these counties, now everybody in these counties is starting to be affected by the volatility, just to the point you made. So a couple of little things to think about in terms of the data also in the results is that, in these counties, there was something on the order of about $300 million of state and local tax revenue that were generated because of what happened with the economic activity in and beyond through the economic impacts with this industry, and somewhere across the entire supply chain of about 12,000 jobs. So, I mean, there are people when that changes, it's going to be felt in other places. And then we have to think about things like workforce development. So you think about industry challenges and opportunities, thinking about workforce development and the entrepreneurship that's there, and losing these firms, really losing niche entrepreneurship that existed, that we could have told stories about, especially had they moved from unregulated to regulated, and built that sort of book of, and again, thinking about the wine industry, this kind of running home to mama for me again, is, these, classic places in Sonoma and Napa counties that are worldwide known, that could have started to build up for, let's say, nationalization later, where we'd have this niche pocket that would have premium pricing because people would want to pay for that story or pay for that quality. Those, to me, are one of the things that really is a missed opportunity. Had the regulatory environment, economic development, and the industry itself all kind of had a partnership right off the top. And I shouldn't say the partnership wasn't there, and it has not been there in pockets. It definitely has been there, but more complete and forward thinking in terms of, okay, we need to prepare to become a global leader in this when we actually have the opportunity to become one. And if not, we can certainly, make sure that we reward and utilize these stories to really say, hey, especially in Mendocino and Humboldt counties, but you could also say in Trinity and Sonoma as sort of, classic leaders too. There's amazing things that have happened there, especially on the medical side, that might get lost if these firms go away. So can we make vertical integration happen? So again, thinking about tourism as another little piece on the other side of retail, can we start to think about vertically integrating, bringing more manufacturing, distribution, and retail that may be connected to visitors into Humboldt, Mendocino, and even all the other 4 counties in the study area? Should we start thinking about that these industries are not only thinking what's happened within the industry, but you have to think about competition coming outside? So where's the competition, and how are we seeing those forces affect decisions to not only produce a certain amount, but also to remain in the industry? This sort of dichotomy between medical and adult use, thinking about where you can find equity financing or even debt financing for growth. So another thing that I should have remembered to say earlier was that one of the biggest challenges I also heard about was, if we want to grow, we basically have to grow from cash that we've accumulated, and we do not have an overt way to easily deposit money in banks, to be able to utilize lines of credit, to be able to bridge over time where we're waiting for revenue to come in after product has gone out the door. In a classic sense, you would say, okay, you'd get a letter of credit, you'd be able to invoice and have a purchase order and just get in this sort of billing rhythm and be able to utilize different lines of credit to wait the 30, 40 days, or even be able to issue a line of credit. None of that exists in sort of a grand scale way. Some financial institutions have dove into that pool a little bit, but it hasn't happened in such a way that I can just wake up and I know exactly where I can get the money. It still has relatively large transactions costs. So thinking about that as sort of the industry challenges and opportunities, I think there is an opportunity for more professionalism where it can happen. But right now, it's really just a fight just to stay alive and kind of keep the foundation where it is. At least that's been my viewpoint since the study ended, and kind of keeping my eyes on the continued evolution.
Absolutely. We're hanging on by our fingernails. That's a fact. Well, it's 12:42, and so I'd love to sort of transition to invite our attendees to participate and go ahead and field some Q&A. If you're cool with that, Rob, I'll go ahead and put forward. Daniel offered a question in the chat, asks how you landed on the size of the unregulated market being 30% of the regulated market. Was it more based on survey data or literature review?
So it was based on two items. The literature really did not tell that tale at all, unfortunately. But my advocacy group and the groups we had assembled that were kind of one-on-one interviews, or kind of my on the street information group, we kind of came together and said, look, if we ask everybody we know, what do we feel like is probably a good percentage? And what we actually came up with was, from the survey work and from our group, was about 29.5. And so I just rendered it up to 30 to make it easy for the reader. But it was really more of a qualitative assessment from our experts than it was, let's say, data driven, or after a really kind of painstaking knocking on doors of people we knew were running unregulated businesses and saying, hey, how much larger a percentage are you doing, or how much are you doing, so I can compare it to the regulated world. So to me, the 30% is probably an undercount, but we wanted to stay conservative. But for better or for worse, we got it through more of a qualitative assessment and our ring of experts than from a data source of the literature.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it really speaks to the importance of community engaged research when it comes to cannabis, particularly at this nascent stage of things,
But Genine, to that point, I was going to say real quick, to that point, the regulators should want to get beyond that, right? It should not take that kind of Herculean effort just to generate one number, right? Two things is, one, we want to be able to, track it for the betterment of everybody's knowledge. And second, to try to think about, okay, if it is 30%, wow, that's a lot of people and a lot of volume that we could provide either amnesty or some regulatory pathway by which to become regulated, or to do something from an economic development standpoint that help everybody. So I think we should always keep that in mind when we're thinking about how we're looking at research in this industry. We have to partner across everybody. The regulators also need to get more involved, in my mind.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to do around public trust and being simultaneously under prohibition and taxation and regulation. It's a challenging thing to advance, frankly. So want to encourage folks to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. We've got a question from Joanna. She writes, state financial support has been given to local jurisdictions to get folks licensed, but I don't believe funding's been sent to these communities for economic development, meaning build out infrastructure like you described, lounges, tourism, appellations, etc. What does that economic development look like for wine, and how could that be applied for North Coast cannabis to really enhance the industry?
Absolutely. So in the wine industry, there are long-standing advocacy groups that are in really good partnership with our elected officials, and funding has come to open up tasting rooms, to facilitate bringing more of the wine industry to downtowns. So if you look at places like Healdsburg, California, Sonoma, California, to a certain extent, Santa Rosa, California, those three are really good showcases of how there's been some failed attempts, Santa Rosa, and some amazing transformations, Healdsburg and Sonoma, and obviously downtown Napa, which is basically, you know, a wine industry or wine drinkers playground. Those places have really thought about, how do I not oversaturate the market, but really act as like a beginning place that if I'm new to the industry, or I want a wide breadth of possibilities in the industry, I can find it in a place that's about, you know, 100 yards from my hotel room. So it's really about thinking more globally about connecting to customers, and economic development in those cities or in those counties have been very good on the wine side of doing that. I have not seen that in the cannabis industry, even though there are pockets of it. So the lounge movement, as it sits, but it's not, let's say, completely integrated with city or county economic development. That sort of say, okay, great, you got it, great. So this looks, you know, one step closer to Amsterdam, knock yourself out. But it hasn't been like, hey, this lounge is opening and we really want to bring the world of Northern California cannabis to you. And I have not seen what I would consider to be a broad marketing campaign where economic development dollars are going to, in a parallel line to one or two lounges that are opening for on-premise consumption and saying, this is a new age. We want to be a place that suggests, hey, we're in a place where cannabis is legal. We want to bring what the world wants to you. And here it is, again, 100 yards from your hotel room when you're here in San Francisco, as an example, or in LA or in San Diego. It just has not been pure connection. Like in the wine industry, it's almost hand in glove, in especially those in places even like Paso Robles, same deal. It's you have a concentration of industry players. Historically, the wine industry's got a really good relationship with local economic development. They work together primarily because the tourism that comes, everybody gets fed from those tax dollars that come in, and all those are usually kept locally, specifically the overnight stays or the so-called transient occupancy tax revenue. The beauty of that stuff is you get overnight stays, that stays 100% local.
Sure. Yeah, it's really an all ships rise opportunity.
100%.
Well, let's see, we're joined here by Diana Ganson, Executive Director of the Nevada County Cannabis Alliance. Nice to see you here with us. Diana, go ahead, and we'd love to hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Genine. Hi, Robert. Diana here from Nevada County. And my question is this. The bill, AB 8, which is proposing hemp integration into the cannabis supply chain. And here in Nevada County, and I know in all of our rural legacy cultivation regions, there's a lot of concerns of how this could impact us. And my question is that in your research from the North State, were you able to put one of the big concerns is if intoxicating hemp were allowed into the cannabis supply chain, one of the issues is what that would do to our biomass market. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious if you have a dollar amount that has been associated with specifically the biomass market in the North State, because as we talk about using the research that you have done and how it could impact policy, I think that this is a really immediate issue that I know that here in Nevada County and other areas that we're really looking at right now. And so just curious about that value of biomass and your thoughts on what integration of intoxicating hemp into the cannabis supply chain could do to the wonderful report you just did on North State economics.
Yeah, so we didn't really look at the biomass market at all, and I haven't looked at it to my memory at all. So, I believe, though, you can go in the data and at least find the chunk of it that could be biomass driven. But other than that, I really didn't look at it. I mean, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but as we were getting closer to the end of our research, there was more of a drumbeat around hemp and issues around it. So I think that, you know, the industry should be concerned about whether or not there's a mass movement toward intoxicating hemp coming in. But we did not really look at it, Diana, in the report at all.
Yeah, thank you for raising that, Diana. And I would say particularly the small scale craft cultivators are broadly very concerned and tracking it closely and really engaged on that issue.
And
So we've got
furthermore,
a
to your
question.
point, it could easily undermine some of the things, and you kind of alluded to this, it could easily exacerbate some of the downhill slide we've seen.
Yeah, quickly, very quickly. So we've got a question in the chat from Lauren, and I think maybe Felipe too. They write, it's been suggested in this conversation that the state do more to support. What are the top 2 actions you think the state could do to drive cannabis economic development?
I think
I'll let you answer first, and I have some thoughts too.
Awesome. So I'll answer relatively quickly because I think, Genine, you're more on the front line. And because this study was completed almost a year ago, I have watched it, but I have not been as deep as I was when we were finalizing. But from just a general take in terms of being engaged in regional economic development for a couple decades, especially in these 6 counties off and on, here's my take. One is that it'd be great for the state to make an overt statement that they want to support legacy cannabis cultivation and say, this is how we want to do it because we're preparing for something that we believe is going to come, maybe not immediately, but is coming. And we do not want to lose that legacy and that market niche that people kind of, assume is there, but might go away if we're not supportive of it now. So, why is Humboldt, Mendocino, Trinity County, Sonoma County cannabis superior to other cannabis across the entire way it's grown, across the entire clone chain, all the different ways in which entrepreneurship has taken place? Let's figure out from an economic development standpoint, and put money toward a campaign that says, one, we want to try to get more unregulated growers into the regulated environment at the lowest possible burden to them, because we want to start to build these stories to market the same way we do wine, the same way we do our beaches, the same way we do our cities, of why California is superior to other places who might say that they're growing it, but they're not going to be as good as this product here. And then that would really sort of also tell a tale that, hey, the state is thinking that this is an important industry, not now, but 10 years from now. And we're making an investment in marketing it and supporting its foundation today. That'd be number one. The second one is to try to figure out ways for places like Humboldt, Mendocino County is specific, but also the smaller rural counties that have a long legacy of growing. Sonoma County is kind of in a kind of a weird middle space, but of how to accelerate tourism related to those stories. So in other words, get that extra piece of the supply chain that can generate more revenue, that provides more local support and more value add when it happens. Now, have got to get ready for that if it starts to come. And it's funny, what the funny thing is about it is if you talk to travel professionals in Mendocino County, or visitor professionals, they'll talk about, God, we want more visitors, we want more visitors, we want more visitors, but there's no effort to say, wow, you have this globally recognized product that people would want to maybe find out more about or come and consume on site, that there is no infrastructure to support a real 25, 30, 40% increase, because every August or September, you're more worried about losing all the water than you are about bringing visitors. Now, granted, the infrastructure's got to be there. So thinking in that way and having state support for that also, that would be another way to think about the sort of parallel lines that we want to make sure the foundation's there, but we also want to think about expanding tourism opportunities that we don't have right now in mass that would actually help everybody if they came. Genine, sorry, that was much longer than I expected.
No, I really agree with all of that. And I think it really parallels what I wanted to say, which is market access and marketing, right? Those two pieces. We have a really challenging situation right now with very limited market access, particularly for small scale producers and manufacturers. I think opportunities like direct to retail access, direct to consumer access goes hand in hand with what you're talking about in terms of building for the future and anticipating the near-term change that we'll see with some form of interstate commerce and national legalization. And, there's work to be done regarding the statutory framework to make sure that we're prepared to be first movers in that kind of market expansion. But looking at, our organization spent the past 10 years working with largely Senator McGuire in the North Coast to develop the policy infrastructure for the world's first cannabis appellation system, and very much have drawn, inspiration and support from the California wine industry. And in building that type of infrastructure and preparing to launch the program either this year or next, we don't have the sort of parallel tools that we need, like direct-to-consumer sales and, things that we can build around in terms of agritourism and these, cross-sectoral opportunities. We were in a conversation for a while with Cal OSBA, which I think has not at present, they're not well positioned with funding, but they are well positioned in terms of their mission to really lend a hand towards the marketing opportunities, right? In terms of the unprecedented opportunity that cannabis really is as a small business sector. And that's rapidly changing with consolidation. So it's really, paramount that these interventions happen fairly immediately. So I know a couple more questions have come in and we're running at time. So I want to try and field one question in the chat, and we'll see if we can get to you too, Diana. So we've got additional questions from Lauren. How much research covers the impact of unregulated intoxicating hemp, CBD conversions, and inverted products from unlicensed Oregon, Washington?
We didn't really look at what you could think of as inbounds from other states, and we didn't look at hemp that deeply either. The assignment based on the original scope was to really look at the core industry and what was happening there. So the unregulated portion was the one place where we tried to do the most work, because we wanted to at least make a statement of the totality of cannabis, especially for folks that had identified to us that they were running a regulated market business, but then also had an unregulated one parallel, basically under the same roof. So that was more of a lean that way than that. But the second part of your question, and I'm just reading this in the chat, is about excise taxes. City and county officials are very attracted to markets in which they believe have very inelastic demand. So if they feel like the people don't care what they're going to pay for cannabis, they see that as, wow, let's just pop that up. That's another real policy piece that needs to be worked on, in the sense that don't assume, given all the competition, that you're facing a super steep demand curve, that you can just keep on increasing the taxes and you won't actually be to the detriment of the industry. Unfortunately, we're watching this happen in a national way, where our presidential administration believes it knows the elasticity of demand worldwide and is okay with shoving tariffs up, which is in essence the same idea as an excise tax. And they're going to find out hard that that's not the way economics works. So there's a little bit of education that needs to come to cities and counties to make sure that they're kind of optimizing the way that they're setting excise taxes to both be an attractant to customers, support the industry, and generate tax revenue. And then also think about ways the industry can feed off of that tax revenue rather than just stuffing it in their pockets, which has always bugged me. When there's a very specific tax set, it is good from a partnership standpoint to say, okay, when we increase this, and TOT taxes are kind of a similar way of thinking about this, that usually the tourism industry either is having part of that financing, what you think of as a tourism improvement district or a TID or a BID or something that's there to remarket for travelers. Boy, it'd be nice if those excise taxes locally came right back to the industry for the same thing.
Well, we're almost out of time, and I want to make sure, Rob, that folks have a way to access you and also the report, because we understand it's not yet published on the Department of Cannabis Control's website. So if you can offer folks a pathway to you in the report, that'd be great.
Totally. I'm going to type my email address into the chat, but it's EYLER, my last name, at sonoma.edu. So I'm pretty easy to find. And if you just type in Robert Eyler, you'll find me in 1,000 different places, for better or for worse. But if you send me an email, I'll send you the report as a PDF that I sent to DCC, and you'll get the same thing they have.
Amazing.
Thanks, Rob.
Well, thank you so much, Genine, for hosting us and for the amazing questions and for all your work supporting Robert on this report. And Robert, thank you so much for taking the time and for doing this very important work. I feel like this is extremely relevant to a lot of current policy discussions, and I hope that other researchers can build upon it and take lessons from it. And the point of these discussions is for all of the researchers to share knowledge and information, because all of these things are interrelated. So I look forward to seeing more of your work in the future, and hope that you get to do some more work on cannabis and maybe hemp. So I just want to share some of our upcoming events. In 2 weeks, on Friday, May 2nd, we're hosting a conversation series with Nevada County Cannabis Alliance and the RCRC and several other folks. They're going to be screening a short film titled Benefits of Regulating Cannabis in Nevada County with an Environmental Perspective. So you can go ahead and register here. That's going to be a really fun discussion. That will be our last conversation series for spring, moving into summer here, which is just insane how fast this year is going. But thank you so much for following our work and for coming to these brown bags. You can sign up for our newsletter here. You can follow our link tree to register for our future events. And then I think I put Origins Council's website in the chat, but I'll go ahead and do it again right now. And again, thank you so much to Genine and Robert, and everyone for joining us on a Friday afternoon on a beautiful day. We really, really appreciate your time, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you all again in 2 weeks' time. So have a great weekend, everyone. Take care, and thank you so much.
Anna.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.